and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you as well to everyone jumping into the chat. If you haven't already, please do open the chat up. It's over in the bottom right-hand corner. If you're not familiar with Google Meet, it's the little speech bubble in between the square of dots and the avatars logo. You can just click on that. That will pop the chat open. You'll obviously be able to talk amongst yourself, but also I'd like to know where you're joining us from today and what you're looking to get out of today's session. Throughout the webinar, there will be opportunities to get involved through the chat, or if you're feeling very brave, coming off mute and asking questions or sharing ideas and answers out loud with everyone here. But no pressure. I appreciate it's the middle of the week. You may just want a slightly more relaxed hour, and that's absolutely fine too. This I always start these with, this is one of my favourite topics. That's why I chose to do the webinar on this. But storytelling kind of stands out a little bit from all the other topics that these webinars are covering, in that it is not, strictly speaking, an L&D skill, or not just a training design skill, I should say. A lot of the context that we'll talk about in this session relates to the creation of training in some format, be that e-learning, be that workshops. But I think the reason I consider storytelling to be probably one of the most important competencies or sets of skills in my own toolkit is that it is proven valuable in everything that I do, from designing effective training to managing teams and starting businesses, to, what success I can lay claim to. I would suggest that storytelling plays a big role in it. It's played a big role in my ability to speak at conferences and run webinars, and it's played a big role in my ability to communicate ideas to other people, to get people on side with something. And those collective skills, those collective abilities really apply to anything you choose to do. Whether you choose to be working in L&D 5 years from now, whether you're a senior leader in a business, whether you are just trying to get someone at that customer service centre to help you, the ability to tell a great story will be useful. So in this session, we are not going to spend an absolute ton of time talking about the history of storytelling and the hero's journey and etc, etc, etc. I'm very aware that, everyone here kind of has experienced stories, because we all have. In fact, for most of us, stories are our first experience. We learn about the world around us through stories. Stories that were told by our parents and our siblings and our grandparents. Ideas that we might have no concept of inherently. Little ideas like sharing. Big ideas like what society is and why people sometimes are around and sometimes aren't. When the real world concept of death arises, for most of us in the form of some kind of a story. Where has someone gone? Why are they no longer here? Stories have an incredibly powerful place, not just in the world in terms of communication, but in terms of actually shaping the world and shaping who we are. And so I always like to start kind of fairly big and conceptual. In the case of what is a story, I don't think of stories as a collection of this happened, then that happened, then that happened, and then everything was better. Reality is a shared narrative to make sense of the world. Without a shared narrative, things stop making sense. Funnily enough, this has adopted new meaning in the world we now find ourselves living in, where in certain elements of society we have lost a shared narrative. We no longer all accept, within certain parameters, the same story of what reality is. And where that happens, we see the kind of caustic nature of that story not being shared. The idea that there is some absolute universal truth that just is, it's kind of never been true. We've always defined reality as the story that we tell each other and accept collectively. And in the same way, That's what our identity is. Our identity is the story we tell about ourselves. I am a good person because. Often, they are a bad person because. Too rarely, I am for this. And far too often, I am against that. Now, this feels very high level and conceptual, but I think so often when someone says, so what is a story? We think, oh, well, it has a beginning and a middle and an end, and it likes to start with something like once upon a time, and in the end it finishes with and they live happily ever after, or they performed better than ever before, or some horrible kind of overly simplistic explanation of what a story is. And I think there's real value in thinking that little bit more about stories. Stories are not just a way of conveying information. They are not just the surface level narrative that we see. Stories are impactful not because they allow us to structure information, though that's helpful. Stories are powerful because they resonate far beyond the actual narrative. They're able to connect to other stories that we've known for far longer. And when we think about training, we know that any kind of behavioural change or performance improvement work will be more effective if we can attach it to existing schemas in people's brains. Rather than trying to build totally from scratch, we say, hey, you already know this process, let's tack a bit on, let's improve that bit. It's much harder to build from no existing schema to a new understanding than to adjust an existing one or to add a bit on or to connect multiple existing schemas. So many stories exist that we can almost always use a story that they know or are familiar with or have experienced to frame our work rather than penning a new one. And I think that's the other thing about this session is we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about, so you've got a blank page. If you're a budding author, I'm afraid this may not be the session for you to help you get over the blank page problem. But there are better people to tell you about that. I have been writing a book for about 6 years now, so I am not the person to tell you about how to get away from the blank page. But what I can tell you is that learning is all about transformation, and all transformation is a story. Whether you subscribe to the hero's journey or one of the other many, many models for what is a story and what form do stories take, all of them ultimately are about someone going through something, transforming in some way, and being different at the end. If those elements do not happen, it's not a story. You've just gone, there's this person over here. Ta-da! Nothing happens to them, they're never challenged, and they never change. That person doesn't exist. We all face challenges, we all change. So whether we consistently or deliberately think this is a story or not, all training or all people who experience training are experiencing some form of story. But when we don't think about that deliberately, that's when we get into the world of, oh, well, we don't really need a narrative. We don't really need a through line. We don't need a red thread to carry the user through from introducing an idea to applying it. We convince ourselves that simply providing the information will be enough. And to be clear, the story does not need to have a cast of 32 characters and a supporting cartoon character and motion graphics and audio effects or anything like that. All of that are the bells and whistles. I always liken it to, if you take one of the great stories, and I default to like a Shakespearean, if you take The Tempest, and you put The Tempest on at the grandest theatre, it will be phenomenal. But then if you take The Tempest and you put it on a street corner, it will be phenomenal. Because the story is where the magic happens. It's got nothing to do with how fancy the red curtains are that open and close at the end. It's got nothing to do with how comfortable the seats are. It might make you sit through it for longer if it's cold or warm or whatever. But the story will exist regardless of the context you put it into. And that's a very rare thing. But what might happen when we think about the training lens is that when we switch contexts, we may need to tweak bits of the story. There's a reason why, for instance, if anyone's ever seen like a school production of The Tempest, it tends to be a bit shorter than the full version. Because, I don't know, there's a little bit of fluff you could maybe cut. It's all good stuff, but if you've got an audience that gets restless out of 25 minutes, it's probably best not to sit them through 3 hours of Shakespeare. The story's the same. The characters go through the same challenges, the same transformations. The outcome is the same. We just play a little bit with the format. And I guess that's a good place to start diving into some slightly more detailed stuff around training as theatre. I spent a lot of time when I was younger and at school studying theatre, and it's always struck me that training really is very, very similar. And yes, this is one of those stretched and overextended metaphors to get us to think about things differently, but there are some real similarities. And I want to go over some that are structural, some that are content related, and I want to talk about some ways of thinking. First of all great theatre has many, many things. There's so much to think about. It's not even funny, just like in training. But these are the four that I've chosen to focus on. The first two are structural. All great theatre has acts and it has scenes. And without ever seeing the script, if you sit and watch theatre or a film, you'll probably be able to identify the shifts between these acts and these scenes. Now, acts are the broadest form of structure. They group together those key elements. The classic kind of the act separation will be the establishing act, where you meet the cast and you understand their context, and perhaps at the end of that act, something has happened. Act 2 is the problem, the downfall, the issue, the turbulent experience. Act 3 is the cast overcoming this experience, or perhaps not overcoming it and creating a bigger problem, depending on how long the play is. The classic is obviously the 3-act play. You have the beginning, you have the middle, you have the end. Some really complex theatre will go through several cycles of this. There is nothing to say you only have to do those 3 acts once. Why can't you establish, challenge, and overcome or fail? Establish, challenge, overcome or fail. Once we start thinking about that as a loop, as opposed to a straight line, it starts to feel a little bit more like training. It starts to feel a little bit more like, well, analyse, design, develop. You see where this is going? When we think about acts, they are very, very broad. Scenes, on the other hand, there are a lot more scenes than there are acts. The average act is made up of 3 to 5 scenes. Scenes are all about serving a very specific purpose. I like to think of in training, these are like those beats, those moments where you go, and now this, and now that, and now that, and now that, and now we shift acts. One of the most wonderful cinematic examples of this, and forgive me if you've not seen it, but I feel like it's been out for long enough that everyone should have. If you've watched the Lord of the Rings film, just the first one, you don't have to watch the whole set, you don't have to watch the extended editions or anything like that. The film opens with this establishment of, this is Frodo, and this is Gandalf, and they're in this lovely, lush, green location. And then we kind of learn a little bit about what it is to be a hobbit, basically what it is to live in Wiltshire before the Industrial Revolution. And then we cut from that scene to, and in the past the Dark Lord rose, and da-da-da-da-da, and we establish the other side. We have this really strong contrast between, isn't this lovely and green, and we're meeting these characters, and now here's this, the evil plot character, and then we come back and we establish some other characters. And then at the end of the act, the ring is uncovered, and now there is going to be what the hero's journey would refer to as the call to adventure, what we would probably refer to as a call to action. The reason you're here for this training is, having established all of this stuff, learning objectives, etc., etc. So you can see in terms of what we're doing, yes, we might have our acts, but we can also have our scenes. So the first act of our training might be establishing, why is this important to you? Now, the scenes within that are going to require, a lot of context, but it's probably going to be something along the lines of, here's what we're here to talk about. Here's why it's important to you. And now let's start thinking about why this is a problem or a challenge or an opportunity in the workplace. And then we're into Act 2, where we start to do something. Now, those are the kind of broad structural pieces, but the two underneath aren't structural at all. They're more sort of red thread ideas that run through all of this. Tension and transformation. One causes the other. In fact, both cause each other. The initial tension, of course, is the gap. What are we training for? There must be tension in a scene, otherwise there's no point. What are the stakes? What's going on? What are we trying to achieve? No tension means no transformation. Transformation itself, of course, is difficult. Whether it's new knowledge, developing new skills, applying existing knowledge or skills in a new context, whatever it might be, transformation inherently causes new tensions. This is what makes learning challenging. It's also what makes theatre interesting. Every action causes some kind of reaction and response. From the other characters, from the world in which the scene is happening, from the audience. The same is true in training. Every change we ask someone to make, every new piece of knowledge we give them, every new skill we develop, every new context we ask them to apply these things into, causes new tension. Now, that tension may simply be resistance to change. That tension may be a lack of resources. That resistance or tension may be that the training isn't good enough and isn't actually empowering them to do what you are asking them to do. Great training, just like great theatre, will utilise all four of these things. We will have clearly defined acts and scenes. I often refer to these as the key beats of a learning experience or a training experience. The moments where you're like, and now we land on this, and this has a real impact because, and now we land on that because that has a real impact because, and this is the bit where everything changes. Perhaps we go from the theoretical into the practical. Understanding those beats, the acts and the scenes, informs things that might otherwise be tricky to consider, like pacing. How quickly do we move from one to the other? Well, that should be dictated by whether we're moving between scenes, which we can do quite quickly, or between acts, which take longer. We need to set up big shifts. But if we're just cutting between what is this and why is it important, we can probably do that quite quickly. But getting from that into, okay, now we're going to apply things, that's an act change. We need to do setup. We need to think about how we support people. We need to think about how the narrative doesn't get lost in the shift from taking in knowledge to starting to develop a skill or starting to apply that knowledge in a context. We need to make sure that tension is maintained throughout. And to be clear, that doesn't mean make the room cold or make people feel uncomfortable. It's not negative tension. We are very much talking about tension in the sense of, I should feel like every part of your learning experience is important. If you're ever looking at a script and going, well, if someone didn't read that or didn't click that, it wouldn't be the end of the world. Why is it in there? No one puts something on the stage in a theatre and goes, well, if everyone leaves the theatre for this scene, it doesn't really matter. That would be madness. No one writes a chapter in a book and says, you can probably skip this chapter. It's not important. It's just some fluff about these characters, there's a bit of backstory, whatever. That's not true. Great writers do that. Tolkien got away with it. There's a reason no one would republish his work today if it wasn't already so famous. There's the classic example of Tolkien wrote beautifully but was a terrible writer, which is a very interesting idea. But certainly in learning design, we don't get to be that indulgent. We work in a working context where everything must serve a purpose. Must serve a purpose. And then transformation. No matter how well laid out your acts and scenes are, no matter how consistently you're maintaining meaningful tension through your work, if it is not in service of transformation, delete it. If you are not delivering something that allows someone to do something better, or do something new, or do something in a different context, you really need to ask yourself what it is you're delivering here. What story are you writing? Is it a story that is useful, or is it a story that simply makes you feel better for having done something, even if it has no impact? And this is an idea we'll come back to, is that there is a danger in our ability to tell great stories, that great storytelling can make us self-indulgent. Great storytelling can make us feel like we've had a huge impact, when in actual fact, we've just said a lot of stuff. So, theatre thinkers. There are a lot of great thinkers in the world of theatre that shared some interesting and some obscenely problematic ideas, and none of them fall perfectly into any of those slots, by the way. Artistic people are a bit, they're artistic people. They're great, but they're also sometimes challenging, especially years later. However, I've picked these three because they are the three that consistently, I find, inform me, and when I run, we do a sort of long-form workshop for organisations about business storytelling. These are the three that have had real impact for a lot of them. First off, Chekhov has something called Chekhov's gun. The idea that if you're going to put a gun on the stage, someone better fire it at some point. If you're going to put something in your training experience, it has got to serve a purpose. And that's not it's just there because the purpose is not the SME wanted it there. It's a purpose to the story, a purpose to the user. If it's not valuable to me, don't tell me. I don't need to know. How much time is wasted in compliance training teaching me the history of whatever the topic is? In 1983, I don't care, it's 2025 and this is my first entry-level job. What was true in the 80s is not in any way relevant to me. And yet, in the world of storytelling, we can go, but that's creating a narrative arc. It's giving them a broader understanding. We're painting a vibrant picture of the world. Again, the danger of self-indulgent storytelling. We've got to be really strict with ourselves, because in certain contexts, you could get away with that, but not in corporate training design. So if there's going to be a gun on stage, someone better fire it. Ideally, someone better get shot, because that's the only thing that a gun really does well, unless you're starting a race at some point. Those are your two options for guns, really. If you're not going to do one of those two things, why is it a gun? If there's going to be a phone on stage, that phone call had better mean something and be important. So the other two are slightly different. Stanislavski and Brecht are kind of required reading for anyone who studies theatre. Neither of them are particularly, modern thinkers. Let's go with modern thinkers. So their books can be a little bit challenging to read now, but if you're kind of comfortable picking through I'll just set that to one side and kind of pick the bits that are still useful today, I would recommend their work. It's actually very, very useful. But the ideas that I want to talk about from them today are actually two contrasting ideas that we always have to think about in terms of the story we're telling in our training. From Stanislavski, motivation and realism. This is the guy behind method acting, basically. That you have to believe and be in and be immersed in something. It's got to be real. This may sound familiar in terms of what we do in training. How close can we get to reality? Is our goal to immerse the learner and try and as much as possible simulate a real working experience within the training experience? Or are we in the Brecht camp, where we say, hey, let's distract, or just innovate what we call the distraction effect? This is the idea that by taking a couple of steps away, perhaps obfuscating the work environment a little bit from the scenario, we tell a story that's tangential. We tell a story that's maybe a fantastic version of the working environment, or a story with the same kind of ethical or narrative parallels, but in a totally different context. Has anyone got any thoughts on why we might choose that over a hyper-immersive, hyper-realistic experience? Let me know in the chat. Safety to fail, that can absolutely be part of it. We observe, certainly I've observed people are much more willing to fall flat on their face when they are, I don't know, Andrabar, the angry dwarven barbarian, than they are them in the workplace. Get a lot of exposure to different content. The problem is converting it to relevant training. Yes, yeah. So the basic idea is that if you take people away from, or provide some kind of distraction, you're going to create something that requires reflection. You're going to create something that is reflective by nature, because it's not a direct one-to-one. No one is going to come out of and I'll use the example that I shared with TLDC last year, using Dungeons and Dragons to train senior leadership teams on communication skills. No one is coming out of that going, well, that is exactly how I will now communicate in the workplace. You can't be busting out dice to decide whether or not you have passed or failed your persuasion checks when trying to sign a contract. But the value in that was not actually in playing Dungeons and Dragons. It was in reflecting on how people communicated with each other after the fact, and then applying those reflections back into the workplace context. Getting people to reflect is really difficult, especially getting people to reflect meaningfully. We're all very good in answering that, yes, well, after this workshop, I will do the following 3 things in the workplace. We never do them, but we say we do, and therefore we've reflected, and isn't that all wonderful? Genuine, meaningful reflection that actually changes workplace behaviours and by extension, hopefully, performance is difficult. It's very challenging. Most of us spend very little time being truly reflective. We get very little chance to. The modern world is very fast. The working world is even faster. There's so much change, so much tension, so much constant transformation that the idea of sitting back and thinking, what about me? What about my processes? What about the way that I work? It's very difficult to fit in. A Brechtian, distracting experience exists to prompt reflection. A realistic, immersive, Stanislavskian, if I can use the word, experience is all about knowing exactly what to do. You know how to fix this because you did it. You did it in the simulation. You failed when there was very little risk around that and you're in the simulated space, but you now know real world exactly what to do. But it's not going to lead to reflection. It's essential that we understand these 2 types of stories that we can shape our training around. To be clear, there are others. And these are very high-level types. These don't tell us the structure. They don't tell us the kind of characters that exist in this story. They don't tell us the kind of challenges that exist. Instead, they ask us, will this be a realistic workplace story? Or will this be an abstracted story set somewhere else with non-real people? Both can have value, though it's worth noting that in the vast majority of performance-related training, we are going to go for the more immersive, more realistic training type, and that's good. We should spend most of our time training people for the workplace in the workplace. That's just sensible. But knowing when to use an abstracted session, an abstracted idea, an abstracted story to sort of push that reflective piece is really important. I find it particularly useful with more senior leadership ideas, who perhaps it's not about button pushing. There is no simple correct answer. We are training them to make better decisions, and part of that is reflection and thought and understanding themselves a little bit better, and that's going to require a more abstracted sort of experience. So thus far we've spoken very high level. We now want to start getting into story formats or story shapes. Let me know in the comments if there are any Kurt Vonnegut fans or readers If not, go and buy yourself some books. As far as sort of science fiction writers go, probably one of the best. What we're about to discuss, Kurt Vonnegut basically wrote some amazing books and then applied to do a doctorate in which he basically wanted to work on this idea that all stories could be distilled down into a couple of shapes or a couple of patterns. In fact, he worked out there were 6. We're only going to talk about 3 today. 1, 6 is a lot, and 2, there are 3 that are more useful to us in our context, and you can always read up on the other 3. I think somewhat sadly he was actually refused to come in and do the research because the university felt that it was overly simplistic. I think time has proven them rather wrong on that. He actually just carried on, did it himself, put out loads of stuff on this. If you look for Kurt Vonnegut story shapes on YouTube, you will find a series of hilarious lectures that I will not attempt to replicate on this, but it is well worth watching. He did a wonderful job of communicating this stuff. But the 3 that we're going to look at, they are literally graphs. I love me a graph. And the first one is called Man in a Hole. This is probably the simplest and most commonly used story in learning and development today. All these story shapes exist on 2 axes, the good and ill fortune axes. If I've got there you go. Good fortune up here and ill fortune down here, and very complicated, the beginning end axis. As you can see, it's very complicated, very detailed stuff, but don't worry, that we'll have time to go through it in more detail as we go. Each story follows a line across these axes, and we follow basically, usually our main character, for us, hopefully, our trainee. So, the vast majority of the time, everyone that we train is going to be somewhere above the middle line on the good fortune, ill fortune scale. For one thing, they were born, they're still alive, they are employed if we're training them. It would be pretty difficult to suggest, there will be occasions, that they are too low on this line. Thus, this is the most popular one. So, a fairly normal position to start. We're at work, we're doing things, and then something goes wrong. There is a GDPR breach, or what other exciting things? A customer calls with a complaint, or you fall out with your manager, and thus your career is obviously over. And through a series or a single event, you end up down here. You have crossed the halfway line. You are now in a literal hole, according to the graph. And you're about halfway through your story. Guess what happens in this half? Things start to get better, things change, transformation happens, and by the end of the transformation you have not only overcome the original problem, but you are better than you were at the start. This is, as I say, almost just like every training narrative we've ever told. You're at work and blah blah blah, and now this has happened, and now you must overcome it by demonstrating your knowledge of, or by using your skill that tells you to, blah blah blah. It's a really simple story, but it's really effective. This is almost every workplace scenario-based quiz. Thus, we're not going to spend a huge amount of time on this, but understanding that that's the story that we're telling is really useful. If for no other reason, then we can then hold it in contrast to these other 2. Boy meets girl, or person meets person is probably a more relevant, up-to-date name for it these days, but he called it boy meets girl. Here, notably, we actually start from the midway point here. I should note, you can move these shapes up and down kind of as much as you want to. So you could start up here. It would just mean that this would go up higher and this would come down lower. They're all relative to each other as opposed to being absolute. So we're starting here, we're in a fairly normal thing, and then we get something wonderful. In the original case, obviously, a new relationship. Perhaps in this new case, I'm thinking, I just got a new job. Look at that, amazing. I was fine, but I've got a new job, I've got a massive pay increase, I've got new colleagues who are all fantastic. But then, through a series of, I don't know, miscommunications and hilarious misunderstandings, usually in most rom-coms, the relationship falls apart explosively right before the wedding. Or, in our case, you realise that a new job comes with a whole host of new responsibilities and new software and new tasks. and you end up down here. Far worse than where you started, unable to do your job, or alone and unhappy, having lost the thing that was wonderful, or now perhaps looking at a new job and going, this isn't enough new money for all of this new stuff that I've got to get my head around, and I don't know what I'm doing, and I've given up all the safety and security of my old job, which I hated, but felt safe because I knew how to do it. But then, in the case of the original stories, of course, usually by, running across the airport at the last minute shouting, wait, and then revealing this unknown truth or whatever. But in our case, through training and hard work and trial and error and making connections in the workplace, eventually, not only do you get back what you had before, you surpass it and have a wonderful new career, hopefully until you get sacked a week later due to restructuring in the business. But we can't control that in the stories. That would be nice if more of them did finish like that, wouldn't it? This is, as you may have guessed, I like to refer to it as the onboarding story. This is what onboarding looks like for the vast majority of people. From the old job they no longer want, to the excitement of the new job, to the struggle of being in a new environment with new people and new things to get your head around, and the climb back up, but hopefully, if all goes well, they get to where they want to be. This is a wonderful story for us to tell. It's more complicated than the previous one. It requires a bigger swing of up and down. It requires a much greater acknowledgement of what challenge takes from us, of tension in the workplace. But it's often a lot more impactful because everyone who has had a job resonates with this story. Even if their job has not had huge issues out there, they will have started a new job because they have this one. If it's their first job, they've started it. If it's their 10th job, they've definitely experienced this. This story resonates with everyone at some level. The third story shape that I want to talk about today is very rarely used in our work, and I think it should be used far, far more. And that is the Cinderella story. Generally, you only hear this in literally Cinderella or in sports stuff, where the team that shouldn't win did win, and it's all very exciting and blah, 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 blah. Even though actually that doesn't usually follow the Cinderella story. We all know the story of Cinderella. I think it's fair to say we meet Cinderella not at the midway line, but quite a way beneath the midway line. Young girl, her mother has died, her father has remarried a somewhat unlikable woman with 2 other daughters that she clearly prefers. She's having a pretty rough time of it. But fairy godmother appears. Or in our case, the instructional designer appears, complete with wand and pumpkin, I guess. And they give her, nice clothes, transform some rats into horses. We never learn how the rats feel about this. I suspect they are unhappy, but whatever. We get a pumpkin-based carriage, we get some glass slippers, we get a ticket to the ball. Things are getting significantly better. And then we go to the ball and wow! Incredible night, dancing, and we meet the love of our life. And then, almost a straight line, but not quite. This line goes down at the gradient of how long it takes an old-style clock to strike 12 dings on the bell. But, even as we revert to where we were before, we're not right back to where we started, because we will always have the memory of that night. That will always have happened. And so, we're not happy, but we're back to here. We drag along for a little while, but then the whole slipper incident appears, which is all kind of just... The whole story is a bit odd when you start picking at it, so like all these old stories, don't. Your feet fit the slipper, and therefore, infinite happiness thereafter. Something happens, basically, that unlocks this enablement. Wonderful. I call this the cybersecurity training story. Because cybersecurity in most organizations is a very big risk. It's a huge problem. So we do lots of little things. Cybersecurity experts engage in what they call the Swiss cheese defense. The idea that no one defense is perfect, so you have lots of them so that the holes don't overlap. So you put firewalls in place and you train people and you put automated monitoring in place. You take all these little steps. And then someone clicks a link in an email and you go straight back down here. Luckily, We can bounce back from that because we can engage in immediate, due to our wonderful tracking, we can engage in immediate remedial coaching for the individual, or just sack them to reduce general risk in the business, whichever one proves to be appropriate. Obviously, that is a somewhat tongue-in-cheek version of that story, but it's a much better representation of that than suggesting that cybersecurity is as simple as man in the hole. Because cybersecurity is almost never about one thing. It's almost always a series of incidents. In that case, there are, as I say, 3 other that I haven't included here, which actually include a story that is from bad to worse. There's really no use for us in the bad to worse story. It's things start bad and they just get worse from there. It's not a helpful training story, but it is a real story. Sometimes stuff goes bad. It's just not one that we want to tell in training because it's not helpful. Now, what's important about all of these story shapes is that by using them deliberately, we can shape the narrative of the kind of training arc, as I tend to refer to it. That main character should be, in most instances, our user. It should be the path we put them on, that they should experience the building up of security in their organization, knowing they've taken all the right steps, and then experiencing, just when they think they have fully secured the organization against threats, the fact that someone they have no control over can send them back down to here. Because it's important that cybersecurity experts experience that in a training environment before it happens to them in the real world. Otherwise, they'll go slightly mad and people might be in danger. The same is true of managers and coaching for performance. The number of junior managers that we work with who do everything that the books tell them they should do. They coach and they mentor and they support and they send people for training and they still don't perform. Because sometimes you can do everything right and the world doesn't care. And what you have to do then is keep doing everything right until things get better, or to improve things to where they need to be. That's a very difficult story to tell if we try and simplify everything to man in the hole. Man in the hole is very good, it's very simple, it's very easy to tell. The Cinderella story is not going to be used very often, but when it's the right thing, it's infinitely more impactful in terms of the scenarios that we can write, in terms of the narratives we can craft for our learner. So, in all of this, I've talked a lot about the learner and characters and this kind of thing. Generally speaking, I consider the person doing the training to be the lead character. They are the hero of this journey. This is the first opportunity for me to say, we are never the hero of their journey. We are the background characters, the NPCs. We are the score at the back of the film. That, we make sure everything's moving on, but, we are not characters. We would have no lines if we were on the stage. We would be, the kid who gets cast as tree number 4, or the sheep in the nativity, or whatever it might be. Shout out to all the sheep. So what I like to think about in terms of transformation is we have transformation of character and transformation of knowledge. So when we're talking about transformation of character, we're talking about mindset, behaviour and confidence. How have they changed as people? And we should be thinking exactly the same thing in terms of training. The person we have trained, have we adjusted a mindset? Have we changed a behaviour? Have we provided them with additional or enough confidence? I separate those out from this other side, knowledge, because they don't generally move in tandem. More knowledge very rarely makes you better at what you do. It can do, but only generally if you're already pretty good. Knowledge alone will not lead to positive action. We need both sides to move. So we need the right mindset. Again, training mindset is a whole minefield, but we'll skip that today. We need the right behaviours. We need at least acceptable level of confidence. Then we ask, so what have they learned? What new knowledge have they attained? What have they forgotten? People are gonna forget stuff. The idea that we can stop people forgetting things is kind of laughable. Now, we can do our best to help them not forget the important stuff, but we need to be thinking about, what will they have forgotten? What will I need to prompt them on? What's the thing that only comes up once every 6 months? Because that's not going to get remembered. Being realistic. If I've got to deal with customers every day, but once every 6 months this particular issue comes up, that's not going to be the one I remember. The one I remember is the one that I get 12 interactions a day on. And what's been reframed? What did they already know, but we have moved into a new context for them, or provided additional information and clarity on? We always need to make sure we are providing both halves of this equation. Transformation in a training context requires both, but neither of them require us to be the hero. I always make the joke of, we often create interactions where on LinkedIn you may have seen, I've just spent 6 hours and I've generated 132 storyline triggers and 12 variables, and it's all very complicated. And I get it. We take pride in the things that we develop. Same as sometimes I look at a workshop that I've written and I do sit there and go, that is a well-written workshop. Well done, me. Notably, I don't ask people to applaud me at the end of my workshops for such a well-written piece of training. Whilst I think, I do consider webinars or training or whatever a certain type of performance, it is not performative. It does not require a round of applause at the end. We do not get showered with flowers. We do kind of give out trophies in the industry at awards and that kind of thing, but it's not the Oscars, let's be honest. They don't come with a cash prize or a huge amount of acclaim. I only say that because I haven't got one, you see. I'm slightly unhappy about that, always will be. But no. The important thing to remember is that we train for the benefit of everyone else. If we're doing our job right, no one ever thinks that was great training or wow, you did a great job designing that training. They're too busy thinking about, I am now better at my job, I need to go and do that thing. If anyone is making comments about the training experience or how good the facilitator was, they are walking away focusing on entirely the wrong things. The scary thing is, when we do our job right, we almost become invisible in the organisation. Which is uncomfortable, but somewhat important, because if people are looking at us, they're not looking at their job. So, the last thing I want to touch on is the fact that I said at the start I'm the wrong person to get you off the blank page. And I stand by that. I'm terrible at coming up with new stories. So, following the advice of others, which I in turn stole, I steal other people's stories. And I would encourage you to all do the same, to become story hunters. To go out there and listen and be aware in your organisation of what's going on and what's gone right and what's gone wrong and who said what to who. Not in a kind of gathering up all the kind of little comments you can use as weapons later on, but really in the sense of understanding what stories already exist in your organisations. There will be some that everyone already knows, and there will be some that are brand new. Because there are new stories in your business every single day. Every time someone talks to a customer, there's a story. Every time the business makes a decision, there's a story. Every new product that is designed and created, there's a story. Every time one person talks to another person, there is a story in there. Now, some of those stories will be rubbish. They'll be boring. They'll be of no value. And others will completely change how you train a given topic. And because it's often very difficult to know which is which, I like to think of story hunting as one part hunting and one part composting. So you go out and you find all these stories and you find these ideas and these snippets of conversations and you throw them all onto a metaphorical compost heap. Because what you've got, you can't just shove that into some form of training and go, that's the story we're going to tell. But if you put them all together and allow one to inform another, this conversation happened, that conversation happened, this happened with a customer, that happened with a product. Oh, there's a bit of an interlaced story forming. That's where great stories come from. The rotten bottom of the compost heap, not the new stuff on the top. Not always, but sometimes, very, very, very rarely you'll get the perfect story will fall in your lap. Like a pre-prepared case study, but it's rare. And if we wait for that, we'll wait for a long time. So I would encourage you to hunt broadly for your stories. Don't look for them to be perfect when you find them. You're going to have to obfuscate them anyway. Very rarely can you literally go, well, last week Ted said to Janet that this happened, and then this customer who's actually called this said that. That's going to get you in trouble very quickly. You can take the ideas, you can take the archetypes of the people involved, but you are definitely going to want to remove their names at the very least. So yeah, I like to think of it as a composting exercise. Retelling other people's stories is just as powerful as writing them from scratch. In fact, telling a story that people already recognise, as we said right back at the start, will be more effective, because then you're not asking them to work from a blank page. So we've talked about theatricality, we've talked about story shapes, we've talked about the need to hunt stories. The most important thing to my mind when it comes to using stories effectively is to constantly be asking ourselves a single question. What story are you telling? What is the point? What tension are you trying to create? What transformation are you trying to enable? Those are the elements that we should use to guide us in choosing the story shape, in terms of whether or not it's a realistic or an abstracted story, and the format that we tell the story in. Do we need to be together in a room to share in this story and move it forwards piece by piece? Or can we do this asynchronously? Is this something we can record as a podcast? Is it a video? Is it a branching story? Are there lots of opportunities within the story to explore that we want to build some kind of scenario out of? But it all comes back to what story are you telling? Now, there are 1,000,001 resources that you could go to about storytelling. I firmly recommend actually all the theatrical stuff from Stanislavski and Brecht. I think they, again, they're difficult to read at times, but they are worth it. I would also recommend Will Storr's book on storytelling. If you want to think more about and want to observe the impact of storytelling and telling small, often stolen stories, there is a phenomenal video on YouTube called Rock the Stage. Now, it's actually a video of a talk all about stage presence. It's a phenomenal video, though, because it touches on how you can use other people's stories, how you can find stories. There's actually a whole section in it on story hunting. I said I stole the idea. This is where I stole it from. It's got 2 speakers in it, and they're both fantastic, but both wildly different in their approach to speaking, communicating, and telling stories, but they do both do it. So if you're ever sort of thinking, oh, well, this sounds great, but that's not my style, or this isn't how I do it, this can be applied to any style, to any approach. Storytelling is for everyone, not just authors and people who class themselves as storytellers. We all tell stories all the time. We just need to think about the context that we're doing it and do it more deliberately. So with that, and I think for the first time ever, I have actually finished at the time that I predicted I was going to finish. Which, if you know me at all, you'll know that is a genuine and unusual achievement. It's usually I'll cut those last 6 slides out because I've talked for far too long. So, if anyone's got any questions or things they want to dive into, you can either drop it in the chat or you can come off mute and speak into the world, which no one ever wants to do, but who knows, today might be the day.
Hi, good afternoon, Thomas.
Hello, how you doing?
Good. So I just want to get some clarity. I'm not too familiar with stories or theater. So when you refer to the Cinderella story, I have 2 screens. When you refer to the Cinderella story,
Yes.
that is what you recommend for the entire training or for a scenario within the training?
So, kind of up to you. You could apply it at either level. I think you've kind of touched on something really valuable there. You could totally tell that as a single scenario, where you're faced with decisions, or you could make that the entire structure of the training intervention itself. It really is up to you. I'm a big fan of shorter content, and so I tend to go to, you write the scenario to the story. However, the most important question is, what's going to have the desired impact on my end user? Always. So whilst my preference is short content, if I know my audience don't prefer that, or that hasn't worked in the past, I'll write a longer piece. So it could be that you kind of, the bigger, I guess, story you could tell here is you do all your small interventions in terms of putting someone through their cybersecurity training, all those little steps up. All these little steps are all your little bits of training. And then you test them using fake phishing emails, those kind of classic ones that people send out. And then bam, when someone gets it wrong, they experience this journey. What that does means, obviously, those who don't experience that journey. So you need to find a way of making them still aware of this stuff. But you can then think about how that story, do they then start a different story? Becomes the challenge. The bigger your story is, the more variance there's going to be, because people are people and they're going to do stuff you don't expect, which is one of the reasons I like telling smaller things and creating smaller pieces of content. But if you wanted to use it as a model for the entire course, you absolutely could do. You're just playing with bigger stakes, I guess, would be my only point of warning.
So
does that make more sense?
Branching? Yes. So this would be a form of branching where someone would select, what is it called? An answer choice, and that would direct how they experience the training?
Possibly. I mean, if you were building it as like a small piece, you could go with a sort of branching scenario. If you were doing it as a bigger piece, you could have it that, okay, all these little steps, maybe that's a workshop, that's a piece of micro-learning, that's a resource they've done, that's a whatever final assessment. And then here, they might get, the training is now over, congratulations, you're fully whatevered in the business. And then a week later, you send out a bunch of fake phishing emails. And you can guarantee that 30 to 40% of people will click it despite the training telling them not to, and so they come back down to here. And then you step back in with coaching and remedial and all this kind of thing, and you communicate to everyone. Hey, we did all this training, thank you for attending. However, we did a test last week and 30% of people failed it. So please remember the following things. And this little piece here kind of becomes, although it's a big line, that line could be made up by an email. The experience of, you have clicked a phishing link. Here's an article to read to remind you of everything you just learned. Sometimes that's enough to get people to go, I didn't take this seriously, now I'll take it seriously. So that would be kind of bigger than building it as just a branching scenario, but would, as I say, come with more variance, more cost, much bigger stakes. You would really need to get probably quite a significant level of buy-in from your senior leadership team to make that a reality, that you could tell that story. But I would suggest it's likely to be very impactful compared to a lot of cybersecurity training, which is very safe, contained, no real-world stakes. So yeah, either one is correct, as it were. The focus is just on, what budget have you got, what scale are you working at, what's going to have the desired impact.
Okay. Thank you.
My pleasure.